In Paris this week, 26 of Ukraine's allies gathered under French President Emmanuel Macron's leadership, committing to what he described as the first concrete step toward securing Kyiv's future. The so-called Coalition of the Willing pledged to provide Ukraine with a reassurance force troops deployed by land, sea, or air to guarantee security the moment fighting halts. It was a signal that the West intends to back Kyiv not only in war, but also in whatever fragile peace might follow. But in Moscow, the message could not have been clearer. Russian President Vladimir Putin will not tolerate Western forces in Ukraine under any label. Speaking at an economic forum in Vladivostok, he warned that any foreign troops, even those billed as peacekeepers, would be treated as legitimate targets for destruction. The audience of Russian officials and business leaders responded with applause, underscoring the chilling resonance of his threat. Putin's rejection came just a day after the Paris summit, underscoring the gulf between Western aspirations for post-war security and the Kremlin's vision for Ukraine. If some troops appear there, especially now while the fighting's going on, we proceed from the premise that these will be legitimate targets, he declared. For Macron, the reassurance force is not meant to escalate the war, but to deter further Russian aggression once guns fall silent. The force does not have the will or the objective of waging war against Russia, he stressed, adding that deployment would be behind the front lines. Yet he offered few details on which countries would send soldiers, or in what numbers. According to Dr. and Clement, a defense analyst at Sciences Po Paris, Macron is walking a tightrope. France wants to show resolve, but not provoke escalation. The reassurance force is meant as a tripwire, a visible symbol that the West will not abandon Ukraine after a ceasefire, she explained. But to Putin, even symbolic troops are a red rag to a bull. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky welcomed the Paris decision, describing it as a milestone, but admitted it was premature to talk about concrete deployments. Privately, European diplomats admit that sending troops risks feeding Putin's narrative of a Western plot against Russia. The United States, while non-committal on boots on the ground, has hinted that its role could come in the form of air support. Putin, however, has consistently framed the West's efforts as provocations designed to prolong the war. His spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, blasted European initiatives as outrageous efforts to provoke continuation of the war, while praising U.S. President Donald Trump's constructive approach. Trump has floated the idea of air protection for Ukraine's skies, but his record is inconsistent. He alternates between ultimatums and praise for Putin's openness to dialogue. Despite his harsh words for Europe, Putin signaled he remains open to talks with Zelensky, though only in Moscow, a proposition Kyiv dismissed as unserious. The best place for this is the Russian capital, in Hero City, Moscow, Putin said, drawing fresh applause in Vladivostok. For Western leaders, the suggestion looked more like political trolling than a genuine peace overture. Professor Nikolai Petrov, a Russian politics specialist at King's College London, argues that the Moscow invitation is part of a strategy to shift the optics of the war. By inviting Zelensky to Moscow, Putin tries to project himself as magnanimous, as the one who holds the keys to peace. But everyone knows it's a trap. Accepting such terms would mean legitimizing Russia's annexations and undermining Ukraine's sovereignty. The Kremlin insists that Russia itself should be a guarantor of Ukraine's security, an idea Kyiv and its allies reject as paradoxical. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte bluntly stated, "Why are we interested in what Russia thinks about troops in Ukraine? It's a sovereign country. It's not for them to decide." Western governments are exploring historical models, such as the Korean Peninsula, where ceasefire has held for decades despite the absence of a formal peace treaty enforced by a heavily armed Allied presence. For Ukraine, such an arrangement could provide breathing space without conceding territory. But for Putin, foreign soldiers represent both a direct military threat and a symbolic intrusion into what he sees as Russia's rightful sphere of influence. Dr. Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, notes that these visions are fundamentally incompatible. When NATO talks about guarantees, they mean deterring Russia. When Putin talks about guarantees, he means rewriting Ukraine's sovereignty under Russian supervision. There's no overlap. It's like trying to build a bridge where the two sides of the river don't meet. Putin's confidence rests on three pillars. First, his belief that Russian forces retain the battlefield initiative. Second, his strengthening ties abroad, from handshakes with China Xi Jinping and North Korea's Kim Jong-un to trilateral meetings with India. And third, the perception that U.S. pressure lacks teeth. Trump's failure to enforce sanctions deadlines or ultimatums has convinced the Kremlin that Washington is more interested in optics than consequences. Russia doesn't believe in Western staying power, said Dr. Tatiana Stanovaya, a political analyst at the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center. Putin is betting that Western unity will fracture over time, that domestic politics in the U.S. and Europe will force compromises that favor Moscow. That's why he can afford to be uncompromising now. Light at the end of the tunnel, Putin recently mused, referring to possible peace. But as BBC's Steve Rosenberg observed, Russia and the West appear to be traveling through entirely different tunnels toward incompatible destinations. For Europe and Ukraine, light means an enforceable ceasefire and security guarantees to deter another invasion. For Putin, it means victory on his terms and the foundation of a new global order that elevates Russia alongside China and other partners opposed to Western dominance. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz emphasized that securing a ceasefire must come first, followed by strong security guarantees. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer described Western support for Ukraine as an unbreakable pledge. Yet Putin remains unmoved, declaring any ceasefire meaningless without a full peace deal. And on Moscow's terms, General Richard Barrons, a retired British Army commander, warned that the West must prepare for a long struggle. Peacekeeping without peace is a contradiction. If NATO puts troops in Ukraine, they will be tested. If NATO doesn't, Russia will test Ukraine again. Either way, the pressure doesn't disappear. This is about credibility as much as it is about territory. More than 3.5 years into Russia's invasion, the prospects for a compromise remain bleak. Western leaders suspect Moscow is playing for time, consolidating territorial gains while seeking diplomatic cover from Beijing and other partners. Kyiv, meanwhile, clings to hopes that Western backing will harden into lasting security commitments. Dr. Fiona Hill, a former U.S. National Security Council official, summed it up starkly: the Kremlin is not negotiating peace. It is negotiating the terms of Ukraine's defeat. Unless the West recognizes that distinction, it risks walking into a trap. For now, the divide is stark. Russia warns that foreign troops will be destroyed, while the West insists Ukraine has the sovereign right to invite them. Each side talks of peace, but envisions it in radically different terms. Until those visions converge, the war and the uncertainty around what follows seems destined to continue.